The stranger at his door. The wind howled across the wide Wyoming plains, rattling the shutters of Daniel McGraw's ranch house. He'd long grown used to the sound. The prairie was as lonely as it was vast, but that night the wind seemed to carry something heavier than dust and tumbleweed. It carried footsteps. Daniel had been mending a harness by lantern light when the faint knock came at his door. He stilled, listening. No one visited this far out unless trouble had driven them there. His dog, Rusty, pricked up his ears and gave a low growl. The knock came again, quieter this time, but urgent. Daniel rose, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the wood-planked floor. He pulled open the door, and in the golden spill of lamplight he saw her. A woman, no more than 25, her dress worn thin from travel and clinging with dust. In her arms, a little girl slept against her shoulder, her cheeks streaked with tears and grime. The woman's eyes lifted to his, dark, frightened, but fierce all the same. "Sir," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "please, my daughter needs shelter." Daniel gripped the doorframe, torn between suspicion and instinct. Outlaws sometimes used women as bait, luring ranchers into ambushes. But there was something in the way the girl's small fingers curled into her mother's dress, the way the woman stood stiff despite exhaustion, that struck him. "You're far from town," Daniel said at last, his voice low and steady. "What's your name?" "Clara." She shifted the sleeping child in her arms. "This is Mary. We had nowhere else to go." Her lips trembled, but she pressed them together, determined not to cry in front of him. Daniel's gaze softened. He had seen that same look once, years ago, on his sister's face when she'd buried her husband and was left alone with 2 babes. She had not survived the following winter. "Come inside," he said gruffly, stepping back. "The wind'll cut you in half if you stay out there." Clara hesitated, as though unsure whether to trust him, but when another gust of cold wind swept over the porch, she clutched her child closer and stepped in. The warmth of the fire hit her face, and she swayed slightly, relief breaking through her stiff resolve. Daniel noticed and quickly fetched a chair. "Sit. Let the little one rest." Clara lowered herself onto the chair, cradling Mary in her lap. Daniel poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup and slid it across the table. "Not coffee," he muttered. "Too strong for someone worn out as you. But warm water's better than nothing." "Thank you," she whispered, fingers trembling as she lifted it. For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of firewood and the faint whistle of the wind outside. Daniel studied her quietly. Her dress, though torn, had once been fine enough to belong to someone who hadn't always known hardship. The little girl's shoes were scuffed but carefully patched. Clara had done all she could to protect her child. "What happened?" he asked at last. Clara swallowed hard. "My husband died last winter. Fever." Her eyes lowered to Mary. "The ranch we were living on, it wasn't ours. Belonged to his uncle. When he passed, the man said there was no place for a widow and her child." Her jaw clenched. "We left with what little we could carry. But I spent the last of our coins for a ride out this way, hoping to find work in town. We never made it." Daniel frowned. "Bandits?" "No," she shook her head. "The wagon broke an axle. The driver left us at the last crossroads. Said it was only a half-day walk to the nearest ranch." Daniel's stomach tightened. Out there, half a day could mean death for a woman and child. "You're lucky you found mine," he said, more to himself than to her. Mary stirred then, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked at Daniel with wide brown eyes, innocent but guarded, as though the world had already taught her to be wary of strangers. "Is he safe, Mama?" she whispered. Clara stroked her hair. Yes, love. He's safe. The words seemed to surprise even Clara as she said them. Daniel crouched so he was level with the girl. Name's Daniel, he said gently. I've got a barn out back with the best hay this side of the prairie. Tomorrow you can see the horses if you like. Mary's little face brightened just a fraction. She nodded shyly, then tucked herself against her mother again. Something stirred in Daniel's chest, an ache he hadn't felt in years. Night grew deep, and Clara's exhaustion finally overcame her. She slumped forward, Mary still in her lap. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He hadn't planned on company, much less a widow and her child, but leaving them to fend for themselves wasn't something he could stomach. Quietly, he lifted Mary from Clara's arms and carried her to the small cot in the corner of the room. The girl barely stirred, her tiny hand curling into the blanket as he tucked her in. Then, with careful strength, he helped Clara to his own bed. She resisted at first, murmuring something about propriety, but she could hardly keep her eyes open. "You'll sleep here," he said firmly. "Don't argue. I'll take the chair." Before she could protest again, she was already half asleep, her lips parting in the soft breaths of deep slumber. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching her. The way her brow smoothed as she finally found rest tugged at something deep inside him. Rusty patted over, giving a soft whine as if to say, "You've taken them in now, you'll have to see it through." Daniel sank into the chair, staring into the fire. He hadn't asked for this. His life had been simple: work, land, and silence. But now, under his roof, slept a woman with haunted eyes and a little girl who needed more than the world had given her. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, not even to himself, he knew already that his heart was no longer his own. A place to belong. The sun rose golden over the prairie, painting the sky with streaks of rose and amber. Daniel stepped out to the porch with his coffee mug, his gaze sweeping across the wide fields. Normally, this hour belonged to him alone. Silence, the call of meadowlarks, the steady rhythm of another day's work waiting. But this morning, there was something different. A soft laugh drifted through the open window, light and tentative, like a melody he hadn't heard in years. He turned his head. Inside, Clara was kneeling beside the hearth, coaxing Mary to eat a slice of cornbread. The girl's smile was small, hesitant, but real. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, warmer than the sunrise. Rusty wagged his tail beside him as if in agreement. The house feels alive again. When he came back in, Clara quickly straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I hope you don't mind. Mary woke hungry, so I thought I'd warm the bread you left on the shelf." Daniel shook his head. "Don't mind at all. That bread's better used than gathering dust." Mary peeked up at him, chewing carefully. "Mama says we'll work to pay you back," she said in a small voice. Clara flushed. "Mary." But Daniel only crouched, resting his big hands on his knees. "I reckon there's plenty work here if your mama's set on it. A ranch always needs an extra pair of hands." Clara met his eyes then, something like relief softening her guarded expression. "Thank you." The day stretched on with chores. Daniel saddled his horse and showed Clara where the water trough needed mending. She surprised him. Her hands were quick, not afraid of splinters or the weight of a hammer. "You've done this before," he remarked, watching her steady the wood. "My father raised me on a farm," she said simply. "I never minded work." Mary followed at their heels, giggling when Rusty ran circles around her. For the first time, Daniel noticed her laughter carried no weight of sorrow. It was pure, like any child's ought to be. And for the first time in years, he found himself smiling without effort. At midday, Clara insisted on cooking. Daniel tried to argue. She was his guest, after all, but she gave him a look that brooked no nonsense. "You've taken us in," she said firmly. "Let me at least put a meal on the table." He relented, though secretly he liked the way her voice carried quiet strength. The smell of stew soon filled the cabin, rich and savory. Mary sat at the table, swinging her legs, while Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching Clara move about the small kitchen. She was not graceful in a polished way. Her dress was still frayed, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, but there was a kind of beauty in her determination. When they sat down to eat, Mary whispered, "It feels like home, Mama." The words caught Clara off guard. Her eyes shimmered, but she only pressed a kiss to her daughter's hair and said softly, "Eat, love." Daniel heard it, though, and the words rooted deep in him. That evening, after the day's labor and supper, Clara stepped outside. Daniel found her standing by the corral, gazing at the horizon where the last of the light burned away. "This land," she murmured, almost to herself, "it's so wide, makes a person feel both small and free." Daniel joined her, resting an elbow on the fence. "It can be lonely, too." She looked at him then, and he felt the weight of her eyes, tired but strong, carrying the scars of loss and yet the spark of someone not beaten by it. "You've been alone a long time," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a truth she could see plain. Daniel swallowed. "Since my sister passed. She had children, but they didn't make it through the winter. After that, I stayed out here. Work was simpler than people." Clara lowered her gaze. "I know that feeling. When my husband died, I thought maybe I'd vanish too. But Mary kept looking at me, needing me, and so I kept moving." The wind stirred her hair then, brushing it against her face. Without thinking, Daniel reached and gently tucked the strand behind her ear. The closeness startled them both. Clara's breath caught, and for a heartbeat, the world fell still. Later, when Mary was asleep on the cot, Clara sat near the fire sewing a tear in her daughter's dress. Daniel watched from his chair, the flickering light casting a golden halo around her. "You don't have to fix everything in one night," he said quietly. She gave a faint smile. "A mother doesn't get the luxury of waiting." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Clara, you and Mary don't have to keep running. You've got a place here, if you want it." Her hands stilled on the fabric. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. "You'd take us in, just like that. You said it yourself. Mary needs shelter. And," he hesitated, words heavier than he expected, "and my heart needs you." The silence stretched. Clara's lips parted, trembling. "Daniel," she whispered, "don't offer what you'll regret." "I don't regret it," he said firmly. "I've lived too many years in an empty house. You too," he paused, his voice thick. "You make it feel alive again." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Setting aside the mended dress, she rose slowly, crossing to him. She stood before him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with trembling hands, Clara reached and rested her fingers lightly on his shoulder. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," she said softly. "But tonight, I believe you." Daniel rose, towering over her, yet gentler than the prairie breeze. He cupped her face, searching her eyes, waiting for the faintest nod. When it came, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was not fierce, not hurried, but deep with unspoken promise, two lonely souls finding a place to belong. The fire crackled, Mary stirred in her sleep, and outside the wind whispered across the wide plains. But inside the ranch house, for the first time in years, Daniel McGraw knew he was no longer alone. And Clara, holding on to him as though she'd finally found safe ground, knew that maybe, just maybe, her daughter had found a home and she had found love again.